I am Bernard Herschel. Before my retirement, I was the chief of HIV/AIDS at the Geneva University Hospitals. You may call me an AIDS dinosaur who has followed the HIV epidemic from the very first cases in the early 1980s through the triumph of antiretroviral therapies, a triumph rarely equaled in the annals of medicine. But not everybody accepted the reality of AIDS, the need for prevention, and the causal link between HIV and AIDS. We were in denial, said the South African health minister in 2017. This video describes examples of HIV/AIDS denialism and its disastrous and long-lasting consequences. Note that details such as dates and names may have been changed to preserve confidentiality. A short review of the evidence linking HIV and AIDS. HIV was isolated from tissue and blood of multiple patients with AIDS and pre-AIDS back in 1983 and 1984. During this research, it became clear that HIV destroys the very cells which are lacking in AIDS. This destruction is responsible for the immune deficiency. All patients with AIDS have antibodies against HIV. Populations at risk of AIDS have a high prevalence of these antibodies, and populations not at risk have none. Finally, drugs which inhibit HIV when given early prevent AIDS. When given late, they prolong life and allow immune reconstitution. Despite this overwhelming evidence, many continued to deny various aspects of the link between HIV and AIDS. We can distinguish those who think that AIDS does not exist, or if it exists, does not concern us. Those who think that HIV does not cause AIDS, and those who consider drugs against HIV as harmful. We will consider all these strands of HIV/AIDS denialism together. My introduction to HIV/AIDS denialism occurred in 1987, when Ruth, my sister who lived in Zurich, called me to ask whether it was true that I was paid by Wellcome, the drug company. I didn't have any idea she was talking about, but she said that she had read it in a reputable newspaper called Die Weltwoche. 2 weeks before, I had received another phone call from a Herr Müller, journalist with the Weltwoche. He told me that experts in Zurich had praised my quote-unquote didactic talents, that he didn't understand some things about AIDS and HIV, and could he meet me please in Geneva to discuss the idea of a certain Duisberg, a prominent AIDS denialist. 2 days later, Mr. Müller showed up. He looked pitiable, having lost at least 20 kilograms, out of breath, and with lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma in his face, badly hidden by makeup. He knew much about HIV/AIDS. We had a friendly 2 hours conversation about Duisberg's absurd arguments, with, at the end, a photo session. Some days later, Mr. Müller's article appeared. In summary, HIV has nothing to do with AIDS. It is a conspiracy in order to sell AZT, zidovudine. Unscrupulous doctors, for instance Dr. Herschel from Geneva, with photo, are paid by the pharma industry to pretend they know the cause of AIDS. Thus, they have a reason to poison their patients with AZT and make profit. I found out, too late unfortunately, that Herr Müller was well known to all my colleagues in Zurich. None wanted to have to deal with him, but he continued to pester them until one of them had a great idea which saved the day. To my great regret, I cannot accommodate my schedule to answer your questions, but in Geneva there is this Dr. Herschel. He's very good at explaining things. He even speaks Swiss German. Well, what to do? I called the editor-in-chief, who sounded quite embarrassed. You know, it was so important for him, this article, his testament, so to speak. I didn't have the heart to kill it. He offered me a page in the Weltwoche for a reply, and was as good as his word, and even paid me for it. In the same edition as this reply was the obituary of Herr Müller. This episode is an example of the rage caused by all the untimely deaths from AIDS, the necessity to find somebody who was quote-unquote guilty, and the helplessness of patients and doctors. For a while, the unrealistic hopes placed in the first AIDS drug, AZT or zidovudine, and the inevitable backlash when these hopes were dashed fed AIDS denialism. The New York Native, a newspaper for gays in New York City, wrote, "Recovery from AIDS will come from strengthening the body, not poisoning it. Do not take, prescribe, or recommend AZT." In Dallas Buyers Club, the scientists who tried to collect objective evidence for or against the drug's effectiveness were the baddies. Their cooperating patients, stupid stooges, and the main character who sabotaged their efforts, imported useless crap from Mexico to sell to fellow sufferers while having unprotected sex any chance he got, was the unlikely hero. These headlines display other motives for AIDS denialism: distrust of government, the conviction that homophobia and racism were the causes of a disease which disproportionately affected blacks and gays, ignorance of the scientific method and the medical literature, resentment against the restriction of sexual freedom, not spread by sexual intercourse, implicit in combating the spread of HIV, and conspiracy theories regarding genetic engineering and the CIA. CIA genetic engineers Gallo, Hasseltine, Essex, Levi, and their NATO accomplices Montagnier, Sherman, Barré-Sinoussi, who created the AIDS virus. Therefore, the only scientific explanation for the AIDS epidemic is the biowarfare explanation. However, HIV/AIDS denialism remained an epiphenomenon in Europe and the USA. The real damage was done in Africa, particularly in South Africa. This map, published by UNAIDS in 2010, shows the percentage of HIV infection among the general adult population. Africa is enormous, and it is a mistake to consider sub-Saharan Africa as a homogeneous whole. As a matter of fact, the AIDS epidemic has its epicenter in South Africa. Other African countries are much less involved. But isn't this strange? After all, AIDS originated probably somewhere in Cameroon, and from there to South Africa, the distance is more than 5,000 kilometers, farther than from Switzerland to Afghanistan. To understand what happened, it is useful to compare the HIV epidemic in two countries, Thailand and South Africa. The AIDS epidemic started during the 1980s in both countries, but later in South Africa than in Thailand. In 1990, there were an estimated 130,000 new infections in Thailand and 79,000 in South Africa. In the early 1990s, Sabine Kinloch, Luc Perrin and I conducted a clinical trial of zidovudine for primary HIV infection. We were looking for collaborators to facilitate recruitment and contacted the head of an emergency room in Johannesburg who saw a lot of such patients. He visited me in Geneva in my office with all those posters about condoms lying about and commented, "I wish we could advertise for condoms, but condoms are contraceptives, and if we tried, we'd be accused of genocide by limiting the growth of the black population." This anecdote illustrates that South Africa at the time had other priorities than HIV/AIDS. The long struggle against apartheid and with it the exile of the African National Congress was ending in victory. Nelson Mandela was released from jail in 1990 and became president in 1994. Thabo Mbeki succeeded him in 1999 and was forced out of office in 2008. The situation of Nelson Mandela was particularly tragic. As mentioned, he took power in 1994, liberated after 27 years in jail, liberated from apartheid, from poverty, from powerlessness. He was widely admired for his intelligence, calm, forgiveness and style, a modern-day saint whom nobody wanted to criticize. He was carried by a movement and a party focused on the struggle against racism, colonialism and capitalism, and thus he was woefully unprepared for the main challenge which faced his nation and remained largely indifferent to HIV/AIDS. He did not speak out about the danger it posed to South Africa until the 2000s, when he was no longer in power. The death of his son Makato and his wife Zondi from AIDS may have been one reason why Mandela finally did speak up and expressed regret at multiple occasions about not having done more against HIV. In 1999, Mandela resigned and was replaced by Thabo Mbeki. While Mandela was ineffective against HIV/AIDS, Mbeki was worse. AIDS experts started to pay attention to Mbeki during the so-called Virodine affair. Virodine is dimethylformamide, a toxic industrial solvent without specific antiviral effects. In 1996, Michel Visser, a medical technician from Pretoria claiming to be a university professor, and her businessman husband, plus 2 cardiothoracic surgeons, administered Virodine to 11 patients without prior approval. For this, they were rebuked by the South African Medicines Control Council, which corresponds more or less to the FDA in the United States. In 1997, Mbeki, at the time Deputy Prime Minister, attacked the MCC's decision and invited the Vissers to present Virodine to the South African cabinet. Reports later emerged revealing that close advisors to Mbeki had financial interests in Virodine. Upon his election in 1999, Mbeki convened an expert panel on HIV/AIDS, where about half the members were AIDS denialists. It was widely mocked in newspapers, as shown here. Among the members of the panel, Peter Duisberg, whom we have already met. Other persons who are said to have influenced Mbeki, there is Eleni Papadopoulos Eliopoulos, member of the so-called Perth Group in Western Australia. She was a feature of AIDS meetings in the 1990s, where she heckled speakers, in particular Bob Gallo, with the thickest Greek accent on earth, and Christine Maggiore, an American woman who publicly breastfed her child. Also, she was HIV positive, and with her organization Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives promoted diet and healthy living against AIDS. Both Christine and her daughter Eliza Jane died of AIDS. Nothing better illustrates the differences between Thailand and South Africa, between an effective and an ineffective response to HIV/AIDS than 2 ministers. Mechai Viravadia from Thailand on the left, Manto Chabalala Mzimang, Mbeki's Minister of Health, on the right. Mechai was born in 1931 to a Thai father and Scottish mother. In the 1960s and 1970s, he made a name for himself in family planning, emphasizing condoms to a point that these are known as Mechais in Thailand. In 1991, he was appointed Minister for Tourism, Information and AIDS. Expenses for AIDS prevention increased from $180,000 in 89 to 44 million in 93. One major thrust was the 100% condom campaign, which quickly produced results. For instance, in just a few years, condom use during commercial sex increased from 14 to 94%, and the HIV prevalence in military recruits decreased from 2.5 to 0.5%. At the International AIDS Conference in Durban in 2000, Mbeki rejected the view that HIV was the sole cause of AIDS and instead argued that it was caused by poverty, bad nourishment, and general ill health. The solution was not expensive Western medicine, but the alleviation of poverty in Africa. And a year later, Mbeki claimed that HIV/AIDS was only the 12th leading killer in South Africa, when it was actually number 1, and asked officials to reassess the health budget with a decreased emphasis on HIV and AIDS. Manto, the health minister, promoted beetroot, garlic, lemons and other home remedies for HIV/AIDS, resisted the rollout of antiretroviral therapies, and even prohibited the use of donated nevirapine for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission. She was so outrageous that at the 2006 Toronto AIDS conference, a petition was signed by 7,000 participants asking Mbeki to fire Manto. Of course he didn't. But in 2008, Mbeki was forced out of office. His interim successor, Kgalema Motlanthe, dismissed Manto on the day he took over. South Africa's AIDS denialism had dramatic consequences. As mentioned, in 1990, Thailand had more HIV infections than South Africa. 10 years later, South African infections had risen from 79 to more than 500,000, whereas in Thailand they fell from 130 to 41,000. From 1990 to 2021, 881,000 people died of AIDS in Thailand, but more than 4 million in South Africa. Corrected for the size of the population, AIDS deaths were 5.7 times higher in South Africa than in Thailand. In the early 2000s, 25% of all deaths in South Africa were due to HIV, more than of all cancers combined. It has been said that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is just a statistic. So let me add some perspective to these numbers. 280,000 deaths per year equals 767 per day. That's like 2 full jumbo jets crashing every day. The infamous Sharpeville massacre, where the South African police shot black protesters, caused 69 deaths. In the early 2000s, AIDS killed 10 times that number every day. So these are the consequences of AIDS denialism in South Africa. Less preventive efforts compared to Thailand, an excess of at least 6 million HIV infections, and a delay in introducing HAART, producing 330,000 premature deaths and 35,000 congenital transmissions. What are the reasons behind AIDS denialism in South Africa? Geography is one, the biology of HIV another. In 1987, the HIV map looked very different than in 2005. HIV was almost non-existent in South Africa, but already prevalent in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Tanzania. These were the years when the cadres of the ANC were exiled, most to precisely those countries. In the early 1990s, they came back to South Africa. They now had the power, the money, and sex appeal. Inevitably, some brought HIV with them, victors who were also vectors. Psychologically, it must have been very difficult for the new ruling class to admit that they were part of the problem. The biology of HIV is another reason for the persistence of HIV denialism. HIV infection is silent until AIDS or death. The surge of HIV infections in the early 1990s was accompanied by few deaths. But 10 to 20 years later, this surge of infections produced a wave of deaths, more than 200,000 every year. And only this finally turned the tide against AIDS denialism in South Africa. I won't go through all the numbers in this table. If you are interested, please pause the video. But let me point out that marked differences between the two countries persist to this day, despite the end of the Mbeki regime and official repudiation of AIDS denialism since 2009. In 2021, new HIV infections were almost 50 times more frequent in South Africa than in Thailand, and the AIDS death rate was 7 times higher. I'll try to not leave you with this depressing story, but rather talk about Dimintri to illustrate yet another aspect of AIDS denialism. It started in December of 1995 in Bern, where there was the first preparatory meeting of the World AIDS Conference to take place in Geneva 3 years later. I got out of the train, the weather was awful, it rained and snowed, the streets were covered in 2 inches of slush, and there was this guy who looked like a monk, in sandals, no socks, and strange, he seemed to know me. Turned out it was Dimintri, president of the Association of People Living with HIV AIDS, and we were going to the same meeting. A few months later, I had an appointment with a politician in Geneva. His assistant offered me a seat in a waiting area where there was already somebody else. Pinstripe suit, shiny black shoes, tie-by lamba, a banker. Well, it was Dimintri again. During 1996, I kept running into him again and each time had trouble putting a name on a vaguely familiar face. Suffering Christ being wheeled about the Vancouver AIDS conference, Leatherman in an ill-lit bar, etc. Now, 95-96, of course, was the beginning of highly active antiretroviral therapy. And Dimintri, president of the Association of People Living with HIV/AIDS, was fundamentally opposed to the new form of treatment. This opposition presented a problem, and I made an effort to know more about him, to understand where he was coming from. So he was originally from Zurich, he was a graphic artist, his family was well known, father and brother were full professors at ETH, which is sort of the European equivalent of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1989 he had pneumocystis pneumonia in Paris, was treated by Willi Rosenbaum, and 7 years later he was still doing well in spite of his sciatica in Vancouver. So he himself was the best example of why highly active antiretroviral therapy was not necessary, and that was why he was opposed. In Geneva he was followed by Dr. T, who died himself of AIDS in the spring of 1997 when his care switched to Dr. W. Dr. W was a very experienced physician who cared for hundreds of HIV patients. Now, if you had a chance to look at Dimitri's chart, you'd notice something peculiar. Within 2 weeks, Dr. W ordered 3 CD4 counts, 3 HIV tests, and 2 viral loads. Why would she do that? Pause the video for a moment and see whether you can come up with a plausible answer. Well, obviously, Dr. W didn't believe the first result that she received and therefore decided to repeat the tests. At the end of these tests, it was established beyond a reasonable doubt that the representative of the, quote, persons living with HIV/AIDS, unquote, was HIV negative. This was an untenable situation. An HIV negative president of an NGO, supposed to represent the HIV infected, who used his good health as proof that highly active antiretroviral therapy was unnecessary and toxic. We had a serious conversation and he agreed to resign. Not only that, he disappeared from Geneva without a trace. Baron von Münchhausen, 1720 to 1797, was a minor German nobleman, a mercenary in Russia, with a reputation as a boastful liar, like his French homologue Cyrano de Bergerac. In psychiatry, Münchhausen syndrome is a fictitious disorder in which those affected feign or induce disease to draw attention and sympathy to themselves. A doubt remained in the back of my head. Could this be an example of AIDS cure? I contacted Willy Rosenbaum for documentation of his pneumocystis pneumonia in 1989, but no such documentation could be found. Swiss German television had a popular program where a TV personality named Kurt Eschbacher interviewed people from all walks of life every Thursday night. In 2006, Eschbacher presented a real-life hermit living in a hut in a forest, very unusual for over-civilized and densely populated Switzerland. And lo and behold, there was Dimitri. He looked like in good shape and still claimed to be seropositive. Thank you for watching, and thanks in advance for your feedback. This video is part of a series on opportunistic diseases in HIV/AIDS. If you are interested, please subscribe or click on the latest upload top left.